welcome to this academic year. And I always feel a little pressure because I start out the year. And just so you know, this is actually one of the more didactic sessions. Probably, unfortunately, we do try to work some conversation in, but there's quite a bit of content, and that's because it's kind of a history lesson. It's a little bit of a history lesson on disability. So you've already done your homework, and I know you watched Willowbrook, and you had an opportunity to look at parallels in time and possibly do your module work on this one as well with Kathy Snow. So, Mike, I think what we're going to do is if you want to pull the lecture up, and I want to just say a few words about myself. I've been at the Institute for over 25 years now. I started when I was doing my MSW at the graduate school at Wayne State University, School of Social Work. My focus is administration and community org. And I do a lot of project development at the Institute and grant writing. It's always new and exciting. I also teach courses in the graduate certificate in disabilities. And if you have some time next year and you want to come back and get your graduate certificate in disabilities, I invite you to apply to that program. And it's a 15 credit program. And that's another really great learning experience that you can put on your Vita as well. And I think probably part of the passion for my work comes from my son, Robert, who has tuberous sclerosis and intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so, I live this professionally and personally. So it's kind of like the source of my energy for my work. So, Michael, I don't know if you want to pull the polls. Let's see what people will say. I guess I should go through the learner objectives, right? So we're going to define the 3 paradigms that really shape the field of developmental disabilities. We're going to go from the medical to the developmental to the community membership model. We'll identify some key principles in each paradigm. We'll define one outcome of the ecological perspective and why it's even pertinent to your work. We're going to describe how the paradigms impact people with disabilities, define 3 goals of the community membership paradigm, of which we are in right now, and hopefully shifting to the next one. But that's what we're going to cover tonight. That's our house. That's where we'd be normally, and we miss it. That's our building on campus. So, and I'm not going to say too much about this because I think you covered it. Michael was telling me in orientation, so we can move forward from this slide. I have had close personal experience with individuals with disabilities. It looks like the majority of you have, 84%, 11% no, and not sure, 5%. So this answer often varies with our audience. I know our discussion question here is, how has your experience with a person with a disability shaped how you've seen disability? So if you're an individual that has personally experienced interaction and relationships with people with disabilities, how has that experience shaped how you see disability? That'll be our discussion question. You can put things in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and talk.
Elizabeth, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
No worries. I have had close personal experience with individuals with disabilities. 84% of you responded that yes, you have. 11% said no, and 5% were not sure. So the discussion question is, how has your interaction with people with disabilities shaped your view in your life?
I think for me, I grew up with a close neighbor that had intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then when we were adults, we discovered that my sister has dyslexia. And now my children, I have one with ADHD, well, 2 with ADHD and 1 with dyslexia. And I think growing up, we knew that my neighbor had a disability, but we did not know my sister and my mom did. But just being around them and being able to appreciate the things that they could do just gave me an automatic mentality of like, oh, okay, well, that's your thing. Like, everybody had a thing. And so being able to she was included in everything. She just didn't do it the same as we did, but it was still very different having that, I think, in my home experience versus only at school. But I think that it kept me open to a lot of those things.
Thank you, Amy. And it sounds like it helped you see past limitations and see more of the possibilities of people who do experience different challenges and disability.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know I had probably 6 years of experience teaching students with learning disabilities and ADHD before I had my kids.
Okay.
And so it definitely impacted my lens as a mom as well, because some of the things that my kids would start to do or experience were things I'd already experienced with other kids. And so it was one of those components where it was kind of really nice. I was a little bit more prepared than, maybe I could have been, but I'd already seen or worked with kids to find success. So knew that was more than possible for my kids as well.
I could definitely see that because, you knew you recognized things that maybe they were doing perhaps that indicated that they might have, ADD or some learning challenges. And of course, we all know that the earlier we can provide intervention and alternatives, and getting creative, the better people do in lifetime and in the lifetime, and the better children do in school, right?
For sure.
So that's where a positive, that's a positive outcome of your younger experience as well in your professional experience of working with people with disabilities. Any other folks want to share?
I think so. He's my older brother. So my entire life, I've had exposure to people personally in the disability community. So I just remember going to his schools. We all went to Detroit public schools. So there was I think it was called like a jamboree or something. It was like an activity they did every year when we were in elementary school. So for that long period of time, I participated at the school and we did all the different activities. And the thing that stuck out to me most was the diversity within the disability community. So even people with the same disability, the way that it impacts their life and their, whether that's physical or intellectual, is very different and very unique. I was talking to a girlfriend and she said something, and I was like, oh, my brother has Down syndrome. And she said, oh, those people are so sweet. Yeah. And I was like, oh, okay. I was like, Michael is not that sweet though. Like Michael is like kind of, sassy. Like he's like me. So he's not, just this angel that some people portray people with disabilities to be. He'll curse you out with the best of them. That's just his personality. So I really realized that working in the field and having family experience, that people are so different and there's so many uniqueness among people with disabilities, and the stereotypes aren't true for the most part.
Yeah, absolutely. And even as you were saying your brother had Down syndrome, I was thinking about, back when there were Jerry's Kids and the telethons, and people would say, oh, those children are so, and you actually even used the same word, that, sweet, and, they're always happy, and these types of generalizations that, that everybody's unique. Even people with disabilities, of course, they have unique attributes. And it's just a cautionary tale about overgeneralizing about any group of people or population.
Go ahead, Nicole.
So kind of going on that line of diversity, I would say, like, for me, I grew up with my father had mental illness. He was first bipolar and then officially later schizophrenia, and several different family members have mental illness, and I've had depression and ADHD and anxiety as well. And I feel like my exposure to kind of disability started all mental health related, but as I got really interested in the mental health and learning more about that, both for my own personal interest as well as academically, that kind of opened up my eyes to learning more and getting more engaged with all the other branches of developmental disabilities that people can have. And I don't think I would have kind of gone down all those different other pathways without having that experience in my family.
So it definitely helped create a greater interest for you, right, Nicole? I mean, because your life experiences. So, and that is how some of us come to the field as well, you know, through our personal experiences. And as I, you know, started out saying, you know, that's kind of what brings my spark and passion to my work too. But you know what? I think what we're going to do is.
One more question. I'm sorry, Elizabeth. Ashley had a comment.
That's okay if we have to move on. I was just going to contribute. So I was just going to say that growing up with my dad has hearing loss, and then also working in the clinical settings and working in a more group type setting with people with disabilities, I just kind of learned a lot of the importance of people advocating for themselves. And I think that's relevant whether you have a disability or not, being able to advocate for your needs. But working with people with disabilities is really where I learned that lesson. Like my dad has hearing aids, but even when we go places, he still has to tell people, like, you need to look at me, you need to get my attention, you need to focus on me. You can't just turn around, walk away and keep talking because I have no idea what you said. So then he can't participate in the conversation. So, and he makes it look so easy. He was born with his hearing loss, but that was just something important that I learned working with disabilities.
Yes, being a strong advocate, a self-advocate, and, you know, and teaching people how to be good self-advocates for themselves is really essential too. So they feel comfortable asking for what they need and being more successful with that. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the advocacy movement as well, and how it stopped institutionalization, and how parents who were advocates were a big part of that movement. I'm gonna try to go in and share my slides. And then Mike and I are going to kind of tag team, I think, tonight. Can you all see that?
Yep.
All right. And then we're going to go back. We're going to go back to the polls, so we have future discussion throughout the lecture. And Mike, feel free to jump in too if if I'm going on for quite a long time, because I want to have time for the interaction. I think the best way to describe the differences in these models is for my son personally. So had Robert been living in the medical model, he probably would have been in an institution like you see right there. That's Willowbrook in New York. But right up the road here in Lapeer, Michigan, we had a really big institution where children lived and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And there were lots of institutions in Michigan: Mount Pleasant, Coldwater, Plymouth. So he probably would have been living in a home like that with many, many other people with IDD. In the developmental model, which is kind of where I started my career, right, mid-'80s, he would have been in a large group home, probably in a poor urban area of a town. He might have attended a workshop, or if he couldn't do a task, he would probably be learning the task every day until he mastered that task and could move forward with something else. And today we're living in the community membership model, and he lives in a home of his own, 10 minutes away from me, with 2 other roommates that he helped choose. And, he has, he doesn't get paid, but he has a job 1 day a week. So you can see the evolution as we go through the paradigms. And so I was kind of preparing for this tonight, and I thought, why do I start with this? Why do I start here? And it came to me, and I want to share something about why, because, in parallels of time, you could go way back to BC times and go all the way up through, and but there's a reason why we do start this particular lecture where it does start. So certainly, if you reviewed parallels in time, you studied about how people with intellectual and developmental disabilities were treated in the ancient era to 1500 BC, the Middle Ages, and the rise of institutions. I start with the story of Victor of Aveyron because he lived during the Industrial Revolution. 1760 to approximately 1840. The Industrial Revolution began in Europe and expanded globally to the United States. We went from an agricultural society to an industry-oriented society, with thousands of people moving from their family farms to the cities. In the cities, they found new training and jobs, and the Industrial Revolution transformed our society. This drastically affected the lives of people with IDD who lived and often worked on their family farms. As their family members relocated to the cities, in some cases, they were abandoned and became homeless. These vulnerable people were left at the mercy of their community. They ended up living in almshouses with people who did not have disabilities, and they were often mistreated and abused. The Industrial Revolution assisted in the demise of the era of custodial care and people caring for their family members with disabilities. Also keep in mind, there were less people with intellectual and developmental disabilities living because many of them died in childbirth due to inadequate health care, lack of medications to control existing health conditions like epilepsy, and generally shortened life expectancies of people in general. The story of Dr. Itard and Victor begins to shape the concept that people with disabilities can be taught new skills. It plants the first concept that people with IDD can progress and have lives beyond custodial care. While it will be hundreds of years before real positive change occurs, it lays the groundwork or foundation for change. So Dr. Marc Itard, he's a French physician. He finds a young man at the age of 12. He kind of finds him in his community, and he's kind of been in trouble because he's wandering around the town. He doesn't have clothes on, behaviors. But Dr. Itard takes him in, and they start working with him on vocabulary and word recognition. And he takes him in, and eventually he lives with Dr. Itard and his housekeeper. And they teach him words, they teach him how to read. And really, the first concept of evidence-based practice around early intervention begins to take shape, right? And this idea that people can learn. And some of you shared that when you shared your personal stories about how, important that is, that we recognize that everyone can learn. And it moves people away from, just being an existence to having meaning in their life, in a society. So this whole concept emerges about teaching people with disabilities. Now, a little bit later in time, we've got Charles Darwin, and I just kind of go through some of the key people that influenced where we're going to go into the era of institutions, right? So Charles Darwin is a physician, he's a geologist, and everybody knows about his theory of evolution through natural selection. He later regretted using the terminology, and he preferred to use natural preservation. The concept was that evolution occurred by natural selection. And it was actually Herbert Spencer that came up with the terminology survival of the fittest that Darwin often gets blamed for, right? But popular belief emerges in society as science is beginning to take hold with this idea that only superior specimens would evolve. And it made disability problematic and something very negative. And that if you had someone with a disability in your family, they were kind of supposed to be hidden away. It was like viewed as an illness or a weakness, a deficit. At this time also, we have to realize there weren't any social services in place either. So physicians did tell their parents and well-meaning folks to put their children in the institutions that were now beginning to open across the country. And it was actually a very well-meaning Dorothea Dix that got Congress to pass legislation for Willowbrook. The reason for that was because, as I indicated earlier in my talk, people were just left out in the community, or they were put in almshouses with other people who often abused them. There were things like, they used to call it passing on or warning out. They would literally take a person, throw them in a cart or in a wagon, and drive them to the next town just to get them out of the town. So it was becoming a big social problem. And of course, she was a social worker, and I'm sure you recognize her as a suffragette and getting women's rights, women the right to vote. And it was, again, a well-intentioned idea that turned out to be most problematic. Also around this time, there was something called ugly laws and the rise of eugenics, right, which came out of Darwinism as well. This was actually a law that was on the books. Any person who was diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be unsightly or disgusting object, or an improper person to be allowed in or on the streets or public places in this city, shall not therein or thereon expose himself to public view. So, if you had an accident, you had an arm missing, a hand missing, maybe, you had some other deformity, there were actually these ugly laws, and they used to enforce them. You could get a ticket and be brought off the streets for that. Okay, and this was the era of eugenics. And you can see how this tree, I don't know if you can see the detail of this very much, but it's very much these roots, the way they're making it look in this is it's very grounded in an evidence-based science, like genetics, anthropology, they have, anatomy. So you can see how this idea begins to take hold, which leads to some more disastrous for people with IDD and people with mental illness. So it was Francis Galton who actually defined eugenics, and his area of study was anthropology, sociology, and psychology. He was also, here's some little facts, there's a quiz later, I'm just kidding. He was Charles Darwin's cousin, and he also discovered the fingerprints were not identical. His landmark book was Hereditary Genius in 1869, and this is a quote from his book. It would be quite practical to produce a highly gifted race of men by judicious marriages during several consecutive generations. So Galton's work ignited the eugenics movement that was aimed at improving the genetic composition of the human race. Historically, eugenicists advocated selective breeding to achieve these goals. The idea was that people who were attractive, intelligent, healthy should have children. People who had a disability in their family had a weakness in genetic composition and should not have children, and gradually, selectively, disability could be eliminated from society. Michigan actually has a very strong history with the eugenics movement. And these are some folks you may recognize their name. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, yes, one of the founders of the Kellogg cereal company on Battle Creek. He was an avid supporter of eugenics, as was the Dean of the University of Michigan's Medical School, Dr. Victor Vaughn. And Kellogg and Vaughn actually collaborated on a state board of health and advocated to pass a compulsory sterilization law in 1913. We also have a history of sterilization laws in Michigan. We were the first state to propose eugenics legislation. In 1913, we adopted a forced sterilization policy, and it was primarily directed at people who had what we would now call mental health disabilities, but it was expanded in 1923 to include people who would now be considered people with neurodevelopmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, or developmental disabilities. And then again in 1929, they expanded the categories to include people with epilepsy and other, perhaps they'd committed a crime. So they were also included in this. between 1914 and 1963, there were at least 3,786 officially documented cases of sterilizations. Is anybody, so I'd like to just say that I believe that's grossly underestimated, because I'm sure there were many physicians and families who there was no documentation of it. So I'm sure there were many more people than this actual 3,786 number that actually were sterilized. Now, I'm going to ask you all, why do you think it was overwhelmingly female at 75% that were sterilized and only 25% male? Any kind of guesses on this one? I'm not sure I can get to the chat. So
I believe it's Amelia C said it's always the woman's fault. But I believe it's because some I wouldn't even call them disabilities, but some physiological things that happen in women were considered mental illness. So women were categorized more largely as mentally ill, like hysteria if you're going through menopause, even like some PMS symptoms or things, people would say that the person was mentally unstable. So I could see more women being in that bunch than men. And also women had less rights and less ability to fight for equal treatment.
You bring up some really key points. So yeah, I believe that there is probably evidence that more women were diagnosed with some of these disabilities. And also the idea, I think too, that the women, I think as far as parents go, I think there was this idea vulnerable to abuse when they did have a disability, and they probably thought that was a way of keeping them safe as well, which, and then the 25% male, obviously, perhaps they were underdiagnosed as well. And then someone had a question in the chat.
It was a comment from Amy. Oh, go ahead, Nicole.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think Amy had a question. She just said the cultural mindset was that women were particularly feeble-minded if they didn't behave as based on the norm. And I would add that probably more women were sterilized also because the consequences of them having sex and having a child were going to be much more noticeable and more burdensome to those around them than a male who impregnated a female.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole, for expanding on that idea. I was having kind of trouble articulating that part of it, so appreciate that. Yeah, I would agree with that. And 76% were actually done on people who have, like what we would consider today IDD. Dr. Randall at Michigan State Medical Society believed people thought to create children with hereditary problems were. So remember on these definitions, right, who we were including: people with mental health, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They expanded the law to include people with migraines, deaf mutism, color blindness, stigmatism, fragile bones. And so I put this picture of Vincent van Gogh on because somebody like Vincent van Gogh may have never been, he might have been an individual that might have been sterilized in those days, because he did have some mental health conditions. But also, how many of us in the audience wear glasses or contact lenses, right? Or have astigmatisms or may have migraines. So you can see how grossly unfair these compulsory laws were to people. So the institutions continue to grow, and more people were, lack of services in community. And because the Kennedys had a sibling with a disability, Rose, they were always, as a family, they were at the forefront of concerns for people who had intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so this was a quote that he said in 1963, right? That mental retardation ranks with mental health as a major health, social, and economic problem in this country. It strikes our most precious assets, our children. And there were other people of note that began to realize that the institutions were, not resolving the problem for people with disabilities. There's a Burton Blatt. He was a professor and advocate and author. If you ever have an opportunity, you can look up a book called Christmas in Purgatory. He actually got into an institution and took the photographs. The Look magazine, which was like a very big magazine in those days, they would do these, photographic stories on things, whether it was the race to space or, an athlete who was really famous at the time. So he actually was able to get them to publish a photographic expose of people living in these institutions. So that helped educate a lot of people who were shocked at what was going on in the institutions. And how you saw in Willowbrook in that video, a lot of parents, when they went there to visit, they only saw what they could see, right? Maybe the child would be cleaned up or there, they weren't there all the time. They didn't always see the full story. But they began to become suspicious. And what actually happened was, as most things that happen, they lost a funding base. And so they had to pay the workers less that were working in the institutions. And the ratio of staff to person ratio went down. And when staff to ratio went down, they were caring for, one person would be caring for 15 people who had really significant support needs. And so, of course, hygiene was not taken care of. Medication was not dispensed properly. People were choking on their food. And so as this expose came to light, you saw in Willowbrook that a doctor working within Willowbrook had a friend, Geraldo Rivera, who brought it to the nightly news and did an expose.
I visited the state institutions for the mentally retarded, and I think particularly at Willowbrook that we have a situation that borders on a snake pit, and that the children live in filth, that many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower. There's very little future for the children or for those who are in these institutions. Both need a tremendous overhauling. I'm not saying that those who are the attendants there or the ones that run the institution are at fault. I think all of us are at fault. And I think it's just it's long overdue that something be done about it.
It's been more than 6 years since Robert Kennedy walked out of one of the wards here at Willowbrook and told newsmen of the horror he'd seen inside. He pleaded then for an overhaul of a system that allowed retarded children to live in a snake pit. But that was way back in 1965, and somehow we'd all forgotten. I first heard of this big place with the pretty sounding name because of a call I received from a member of the Willowbrook staff, a Dr. Michael Wilkins. The doctor told me he'd just been fired because he'd been urging parents with children in one of the buildings, building number 6, to organize so they could more effectively demand improved conditions for their children. The doctor invited me to see the conditions he was talking about, so unannounced and unexpected by the school administration, we toured building number 6. The doctor had warned me that it would be bad. It was horrible.
Okay. So why don't we do a couple of the discussion questions? I've talked for a long time, so let's get out of this. And I have a good understanding of what it would be like to live with a disability. In that one, you guys can see the range there. I don't know. I know some of you did share your personal experiences with disability. And obviously throughout this year, you're going to have more opportunities in your clinics and the opportunities you're going to have to work with people who have disabilities. So I think that answer will look quite different at the end of the year. Do we want to do number 3? Due to their disability, I believe individuals will live diminished lives. And I will tell you, so 20 years ago, this would have been flipped. I'm sure of it. So I think it's wonderful. I mean, it looks like more than half of you strongly disagree with that statement. Does anybody want to share their views on that?
So I said strongly disagree just because of the wording of this question, which is due to their disability, they will have diminished lives. So I also, like Nicole, I have a history of severe mental illness in my family, I believe, and so that is something that has also been passed on to me. So due to the disability, I don't believe that, I've never seen it occur where they have a diminished life, but the way that society treats individuals with severe mental illness or severe physical disabilities or intellectual disabilities can definitely hinder that, not for lack of trying. So that was just, it's really a complicated question that I kind of am like, maybe I should have said neither agree or disagree just because of that discrepancy. But if it were ultimately up to the individual, I definitely think that it's a strongly disagree. I think everyone can live their fullest if given the opportunity and being legally allowed to participate in what they actually want to.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Ada, you're right. And in people giving opportunity, I think what you just said, it's really key. And giving them the tools that they need to live their lives.
I answer that I somewhat agree. And similar to what Ada was saying, and it's not because of any deficiencies in the person in and of themselves, it's because of society. So I work with adults with IDD, and amazing people that I work with, super intelligent, passionate advocates and all those things, and they still struggle with the day-to-day things like you know, a large majority of people with disabilities live in poverty. That's in and of itself a part of a diminished life. Not saying that you can't have a great life and not be wealthy, but the fact that you know, unemployment rates, limited access to education, and all the systems in which I'm saying we as in the large society, set up for people with disabilities not to thrive in. It's difficult to conceptualize that, you know, regardless of ability, you're going to live a fabulous life, because we just haven't, we set up a tiered system for only certain people to succeed.
Yeah, no, you bring up some key points. I mean, 75% of people with disabilities are employed.
I have to agree with Amelia. I mean, I have a son with autism, and I just feel like it's a constant struggle and fight to prove that he has the same abilities as any other children. I mean, I'm constantly fighting the schools, and it's just it's just a battle all the time to prove that he is able to do the same things many other children can do. But it's just the way society views them. And like she said, the unemployment rates, that is so true. I mean, look at the rates for individuals with autism. So
I know, Angela, you're a strong advocate, and that you will teach him how to be a strong self-advocate. And that's so important. I know, and part of what Amelia does in her other job is she does work with self-advocates, and you're setting the groundwork for that now. We know if we teach self-determination skills when kids are young, they are able to be more self-determined and be able to set goals and attain them as they get older. And having said all that, sometimes my son who's 33, I say, I still feel like I'm pushing a boulder up the hill, but it does pass. It gets better. So, but I still have those moments, as with my other family members. It's like something will happen and then you feel like you're just pushing that boulder up the hill, but the problem will somehow get resolved, and you'll figure out how to get around it if it doesn't get resolved. And we'll talk more about that too, and about the social construct of disability and the barrier society puts into people with disabilities' lives.
I just kind of want to go off a little bit of Angela. I'm thinking, because I worked with at-risk homeless youth for about 8 years, where I had a young person who was 20 years old who just got diagnosed with autism, and when I was working with him. And I just think about those individuals that fall through the cracks because they are in poverty or they don't have as strong of a support system and knowing where to get services. So I think about those individuals when it comes to this question too. So that's where I'm like a neither agree or disagree.
Yeah, no, I could totally see that. Many people fall between the cracks. Many people don't get diagnosed till they're older, and they've missed that early intervention experiences. Some people don't have the money or for all of the things that could help them attain a different quality of life. But I still like the idea that that we do believe that the disability it doesn't define us, right? So maybe, Mike, what we should do, I'm going to do a little more of the lecture, and then we'll do some of the polls again, okay? Just in the interest of time, I'm going to look over here at my, yeah, okay. So, and hopefully it won't take me too long to find my PowerPoint. There we go. So all of these problems surfaced, right? The institutions were getting costly, abuse surfaced, as Geraldo indicated. He said they told parents to organize, and they did. And the ARC was formed, which is a national organization to support people and their family members with disabilities. There were lawsuits against the institutions. As in any time change emerges in a society, there are multiple things that are occurring at the same time that kind of build a synergy to take us to the next thing, okay? And it's usually policy, it's people, it could be violence, or it's multiple things that bring a problem to the forefront of people's minds, and then we can move the system forward, and it will evolve. And then we have to get funding behind the new ideas, right? Because as I said earlier, there were not community-based opportunities. Okay. So I don't know why this is blank, but the medical versus social model of disability, that's my son. And he gave me permission to use his picture. But if you could see that slide. So the medical view was at this time, and it's not any longer, but it was at this time of the era of institutionalization, as we indicated, that the disability was a problem, something like an illness, right? Today, we look at the social construct and the social model of disability, which is disability is a function of society, and the environment must be adapted to accommodate the individual with the disability. Values and norms must change. Many people with disabilities don't want their disability cured or fixed. They believe it is what makes them unique and what they bring to that life experience and everything that they do. Society creates barriers for people with disabilities, and we make our communities more accessible and we use universal design and knowledge translation, we will reduce these barriers and more people will be able to fully participate in society. That includes people who are elderly as well as people with IDD and or physical disabilities. And so for me as an individual, if I may share something personal about me, when my paradigm shifted in my head was when I figured out that my sons, that there were these barriers in community, at school, in society. And when I figured out that we had to identify those barriers and then change the barriers. It wasn't going to happen that he could suddenly talk. It wasn't going to happen that, he would have suddenly, more mobility. It was, how are we going to adapt this environment? What tools can we give him? That's the social model of disability. How can so that they can better communicate. It's all about like the curb barriers coming down, right? And, accessibility through the ADA. But that really, for me, that was a fundamental mind shift of when I could look at it as though it was something, it wasn't Robert, it was the systems around Robert. And that's where we're going to talk a little bit later on in the lecture about Yuri Bronfenbrenner and systems theory and why that's important. Because when you can do systems work with people who have disabilities, what you do is you identify the systems around them and how those systems can support the individual. And for you social workers, you know all this. Okay, there's my slide. This was the poll. I know we skipped 5, but this was 6. I don't know, Mike, if we want to go back and do 5 and 6 together, or should we go on a little bit more?
That's up to you. I can show either one.
All right, why don't we do a few more slides and let's get them up to the developmental model, and we're heading there right now. So, okay, and I'll take them through that, and then we'll do some polls. So, as I said, there's this shift, right, that occurs at multiple layers. And one of the biggest things that created a shift was to the developmental model, as we came out of the medical model, was President Kennedy appointed a panel of experts. This panel of experts was made up of doctors, it was made up of psychiatrists, it was made up of educators, professors like Burton Blatt, it was made up of people like me and, like Angela, who were parents, and they put together a report, and they made very specific recommendations, and AUCDs were born out of that, the Association of University Centers on Disabilities. They said Congress needs to legislate appropriated dollars to associations and university centers on disabilities, as well as university centers for excellence in disabilities. They didn't call them that in those days. They used to call us UAPs. And then break it down to the state level. Every state needs these 3 arms of disability organizations: developmental disabilities councils, protection and advocacy, and us, my DDI, a USID, right? And I'm sure you learned a lot about that last week, but that's how USIDs were funded, is through the President Kennedy's panel. And honestly, I think this was one of the greatest influencers of change, shifting us from institutionalization into developmental model, because it put money behind legislation that made it possible for us to build community and community supports, right? Now, it was not without problem, because what it did do is it moved people out of institutions very quickly. There wasn't always a lot of planning around this. They were very large group homes. They were often in poor parts of towns. If a community came together and they said, hey, we don't want that house in our neighborhood, you'd have to move the house. You couldn't take residence up in that house. People were really taught a lot through the mastery of daily skills and task analysis. And really, task analysis is breaking any large task into very small steps. think about when you learned to tie your shoes, right? First you had to put your shoe on, then you had to lift the two shoestrings, and you couldn't really tie the bow until you went through all the steps. Well, people with intellectual disabilities, there was a lot of learning with this task analysis, and then rewarding people with behaviorism and tokenisms and things like that, a reward system, right? There were two really huge problems with this. One is later on, researchers found out that people with disabilities learn far better in realistic situations than artificially set up in situations like workshops, okay? Learning skills in a workshop doesn't really translate to jobs. And the other, issue was that some people could never learn certain skills, so they could never get out into community. And really, this was the area of lots of professionals dictating what people's lives would be like. It was the era of assessments and treatment plans and goals. This is kind of where I started my career. I remember having meetings, they called them I-team meetings, interdisciplinary team meetings, where we had the psychiatrist and the social worker and the psychologist, and the person wasn't even there. And so somebody would say, oh, they need to quit smoking, or they need to lose 20 pounds. So, look how we've evolved now in community membership to person-centered planning and self-determination. So really, the lack of planning for the developmental model created a lot of problems, but at least we got out of institutions, right? At least we moved people into community. And even though it wasn't complete integration, it was a big step to actually, participating in life. And I guess if you think about your own life, imagine your frustration of being stuck in a particular learning phase, and not being able to go and do what you really want to do ultimately because, you can't learn a particular task. And so, I'm for my own self, I'm thinking about a language barrier. I always thought, well, I go to France, and my French is going to improve, and I'm going to study French, and I'm going to be fluent when I go to France. And then I went back and looked at my French, and I was like, I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to be fluent by the time I get there. So I went anyway, and guess what? I had a good time. And so I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that too. You don't have to have toileting skills to be out in the community having a job. There are ways we can get around these barriers. So in some ways, if you think about the developmental model, think about it as it was an advancement, but it had barriers to it as well. All right, so why don't we do a couple polls and we'll wrap up with the community membership model. So I know individuals with disabilities are a burden on society. And I know that this question, the discussion question is, what does it mean to be a burden? How are people with disabilities a burden? Anybody can share an answer?
I answered strongly disagree, but in terms of how I think they could be viewed as a burden, thinking about, again, all these different like accommodations and community living supports and all these things that cost money, right? So you could view it in that sense of needing to put some money towards supporting these individuals in the community when maybe you're not putting that same amount of money towards supporting individuals in the community who don't have a disability. So maybe that's one way someone could view it in that sense.
Like a financial burden as well for people, yeah. I actually have heard people say that. Why do we have a job coach, helping someone to do this task when we're paying two people and we could have one person doing this task? I have definitely heard that. Yeah, so there's different ways of thinking about a burden, right? Financial, caregiving. Amelia says if caregivers have limited resources and finances, it may be problematic for them as well. That's very true. Shall we move to the next question, Michael? I know poll 5 was people with disabilities no longer face discrimination in our society. Strongly disagree, 95% of you. Somewhat disagree, 5%. So we were pretty, there weren't really any other answers on this one. How do you think people with disabilities face discrimination in our society? What are some ways they are discriminated against? We've already talked about jobs. What other things do you think?
Inclusion.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. From our classroom settings, some schools use an inclusion model, some do mainstreaming, but some still have very segregated classrooms and schools for students with disabilities.
Yeah, my discipline is education, and I think that regardless of how much work we can do or want to do, the discrimination is part of the system, and even financially, because just what is needed and how you can plan for even finances is discriminatory against people with disabilities, because it's expected to be equal when it can't possibly be the same. And so we have to talk a lot about the difference between what is fair, and what is equal. But even in instruction, because I did a lot with middle school and high school, and there's so much discussion about what is fair to do for kids with, especially like learning disabilities and intellectual disabilities in high school. Because if how much content can we change before we shouldn't allow them to graduate with a diploma? Those kinds of discussions. And, I've always found them to be very discriminatory, because that's actually saying that they're all going to do the same thing with a diploma, for one thing. But they walk into it every day, and it was always so frustrating, because we say to them, we want you to be an individual. We say to them that part of community is being an individual, yet we're not going to set up our system to treat you like an individual. So it's just inherently discriminatory.
And it's really difficult for them to get post-secondary opportunities. Although there are more out there, I know Michael knows a lot more about that than I do, but it's, it's almost like you're saying, Amy, it's kind of like you're setting them up in some ways. The way they are discriminated educationally also limits their future opportunities and post-secondary opportunities and things like that.
I think there's also a lot of discrimination within healthcare, and dental specifically. I found that a lot of general dentists don't treat certain individuals with disabilities, and they're referred to hospital dentistry or pediatric dentistry, and that creates a huge, I guess, it contributes to them already being underserved in other areas. So I think that's a huge problem.
Yeah, and Medicaid, it doesn't apply. Very few dentists take Medicaid insurance. So many children have to wait months, years to get into clinics where they can get dental or optical services. It's a big problem. We hear that all the time. I get contacted at least 5 times a year. Somebody will reach out to, and that's just me at the Institute. Where can I get dental or optical care? My son or daughter needs to be sedated during dentistry. So it's really difficult because it's very expensive to have to do that, pay for that out of pocket.
Kind of going off that, we definitely see that. I'm a PEDS resident, and so we have a list of dentists that is available for families that we give if they don't have a dental provider or are new to the area, and we have to mark on that list and remind parents that only certain ones will take Medicaid, and there are certain ones on the list that work with the children with disabilities well and may be able to get some stuff done without sedation. But it's very common for us to have to make a referral to the sedation teams just for normal routine dental work. And then because some of these kids don't get dental work, they often then have to have like further dental surgeries due to caries and things like that they need further sedation or surgery for. And so it's definitely a big issue.
Yeah, well, I think we've all given really great points as to why people with disabilities do face so many, discriminatory practices and beliefs in our society. Okay, I think maybe what I ought to do is probably try to wrap us up. I'm looking at the time. And I really like hearing, it's great to do the discussion questions. We're recording tonight. So the community membership model is born around 1990. That's kind of when I was almost going back to grad school and got over at the Institute. That was the mid 90s. It was a really exciting time because, it was sort of a new way of thinking of things. People were thinking and talking about person-centered planning. It embraces individual supports, money following the person, people with disabilities driving their needs and setting goals, right? And the whole goal of this model is high quality of life. And we at the Institute, this is in our mission statement, it's in all our grants. We always stay focused on having people have the tools to have a high quality of life, right? Which is what you want or I would want. So there were some great academics who helped us get there with research, right? Because I told you that whenever you see a paradigm shift, I said that there's multiple things happening, outside forces that kind of come together and build a synergy to evolve us to the next level. So that's what happened again. We knew the developmental model wasn't working. There was a lot of great research being done at those USEDs, and some of the names you're going to hear now in the next few slides, they came out of USEDs, and like my DDI, and they were doing extensive research on intellectual and developmental disability. At the same time, we finally got some funding behind community mental health and services, and we were able to do things in people's homes and promote sort of a wraparound service delivery. And so Dr. Wolf Wolfensberger out of Syracuse, his whole research was around, people could be taught skills about how to live in the community. If he called them guides, would work with them and not on them. All right. Instead of trying to change them, let's try to teach them the skills that they need with supports. And so this is where originally people they used the term normalization on this theory. Some of the critics of his theory said, "Well, is he trying to say he's trying to make these people normal?" No, that was not Dr. Wolfensberger's intent. His intent was that people had very institutionalized behaviors that made them sometimes not fit into society or not know how to, they weren't self-determined, they didn't know how to make choices. And so his theory was that we could use direct care workers and family members and teach them how to work with people who had disabilities so they could get more integrated into community. And this really was the impetus and the momentum that gets us away from specialized services and specialized programs like day programs and workshops. And that's important because, we were mostly warehousing people in day programs and workshops where they were going and they were doing like a task over and over again and making like $1 a day. They'd be there 8 hours. And, we needed to move them into real jobs and real educational opportunities. So we knew that the programs were not translating into success. And so the journey from clienthood to membership begins. Again, quality of life is our focus. And those are my children, and they're in Robert's house. So the ecological perspective, all I'm going to say about this is that you can certainly look up and do more research, but with really Yuri Bronfenbrenner's contribution to the community membership model was that he taught us ways of mapping people's lives so that we put the person in the center, and then we would draw these circles. I still do it, actually. I teach a class, I still use it, and I use it often, because it really helps you focus on the focus person. Who's in their life is the first circle. Who are the influencers on the outside of the circle, like their teacher, their social worker, their therapist, the doctor, right? Then you look at the big system picture, which is looking at who's funding the programs. From the inside, we work out and we identify sources of support and where we need to do advocacy to eradicate the barriers in an individual's life. You can actually use this on your own life if you're having a problem and trying to figure out how to resolve an issue. You can identify who's your support and how can you get them to help you resolve a particular issue. But it's actually very useful, and it's gotten, so there's community mapping now, and we built circles of support off this theory, and Star Raft, which a lot of our families use, which is basically building huge circles of support, because as parents age out, right, and family becomes less a part of a person's life sometimes, we have to have community people identified in our circle that can step in and be a part of our lives. So this is a good segue to this one. I would be able to live a fulfilling life, and maybe Mike, you could just read the poll results. I would be able to live a fulfilling life if I had a significant physical disability. Strongly agree, somewhat agree, neither agree nor disagree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree. So it looks like our strongly agree folks are 26%, somewhat agree at 37, neither agree nor disagree, 21%, somewhat disagree, oh, I'm sorry, 11%, somewhat disagree, 21%, and strongly disagree, 5%. Any thoughts about your answers on this one? We have a few folks who would say that they would have a very hard time.
I thought the question was interesting in and of itself, because like, what does a fulfilled life mean to everyone individually? So would I be able to live like, if I had to compare to right now, the things that I find fulfilling and that I enjoy, would I be able to do that if I had a physical disability? Some of it, but some of it not. So it's hard to measure, but when I talk to people with disabilities, whether it's physical or intellectual, you can see that they are fulfilled. Some people are fulfilled and they are doing the things that they enjoy. So I definitely think it's possible.
Thank you. And sometimes when I do this as an activity, I do an activity sometimes when I train around this, I'll ask people this question and somebody might say, well, I ski, I wouldn't be able to ski. Well, no, you can ski. There are guides and there are programs that you can ski. My brother-in-law is visually impaired, and he has a very significant hearing loss. He skis the double black diamonds every year in Vail, but he has a guide. So a lot of these things that you enjoy can be adapted, right? And modified so that you could continue to enjoy them. So sometimes when we think about it for a little bit of time, it's just a question of getting creative and, having the technology and things like that to be able to overcome some of the barriers and have a fulfilling life. And I also think that changes, with age as well. Sometimes older people have more, they encounter physical disabilities, pain, arthritis, and things like that I think does impede their ability to maybe participate fully. It's an interesting question. Dr. Milberger and I use this in a lecture we do with the medical school too. So, okay. Shall we do the next poll, Michael? I would be able to live a fulfilling life. Oh, that's if I had a cognitive disability. So different than a physical disability, obviously. Thoughts on your answers on this one? Because we had a majority here strongly agree with that statement. 42%, almost half. So I'm guessing some people have some thoughts about why they answered that way. Any thoughts?
So I had answered that I put somewhat disagree because I feel like my brain and my ability to think things through and like my higher cognitive like functioning is something that I'm so used to having and so dependent on, and the fact that I've already lived having it be this way, I feel like if I were to have something happen at this point and I know that I used to be able to do these things, I think that would be hard for me to get used to and be able to feel kind of the same about myself. I don't know that I would feel necessarily that it's the same way though if I never kind of had experienced my cognitive ability to be where it is today. And it's not to say that it wouldn't be a fulfilling life completely. It would still be able to be fulfilling. It just would be so different that I think it would be something I would constantly compare to my experiences.
Yeah, Nicole, I almost think it's like a trick question because maybe the way we should be asking this question is, at birth, like if you had your cognitive disability at birth, the way Robbie does, then his worldview would be different. I think he does believe he lives a really fulfilling life. And we show a video. It's called, if you ever want to watch it, it's called A Good Life. And it shows people with pretty significant cognitive disabilities. And they ask them, what's a meaningful life to you? And a fulfilling life. And it's like 5 minutes long. But it's really quite a good, we'll get that out to you guys. But yeah, it's important to think about, I guess to your world, how you think about things at this point in your life. So yeah, that question's a little bit tough because we don't really define that, whether you're born with it, acquired. I think what I really want, trying to encapsulate this, I want you to come away with this idea that another really important thing happened in this paradigm shift. And this is when, remember, I talked about Dr. Wolfensberger and Burton Blatt and some other folks. They got together and they had a landmark conference in Sweden in 1970. And they had people with disabilities at this conference. And the advocates defined what they wanted for their lives. And if you really look at some of the things that they defined so many years ago, they're things that people with disabilities today would still say are important. They wanted to live independently. They want to cook and budget. They don't want to be coddled. They want more interesting jobs. They demanded the right to marry and have children. They wanted to be trained and educated for better work. People want their dignity, and that came across, and it does sound familiar, doesn't it? People want their dignity. They want personal fulfillment, and that if it does sound familiar, it's because I think that's what most of us want. We want opportunity. And so really the field began to take notice and listening to the voices of the people with disabilities and developing holistic services around people with disabilities, trying to reduce the barriers to inclusion, develop more wraparound services, and we had policy that supported that implementation. And one of those policies in Michigan was we mandated person-centered planning, right? And person-centered planning is a cornerstone because what it does is it's the roadmap that builds the inclusive quality of life. The funding flows through the person-centered plan and forms the individual plan of service. We didn't have that before in the developmental model. And we certainly didn't have it in the medical model, but today we do have it. And these are some landmark legislations that were passed that made all of this possible. And really the important thing here was the idea that people's services should be individualized around their person-centered plan. They should have opportunities to become self-determined and set goals for themselves. And how do we do that? Well, we ask the person what they want. And then we build the support system around them. And so what I tell everybody, no matter the role you'll ever play in the life of an individual with a disability, if they get Medicaid services, they have a person-centered plan. It's really important that if something's important to them, to get it into their person-centered plan, because that is how the funding stream goes in and supports the service. And that is really key. And then you build that support around it. We have a few things that we need to continue to work on. People need training in school. Special ed doesn't always equal outcomes. We've done a deplorable job with employment of people with disabilities. We need to do a better job, I think, teaching our children self-determination skills at an early age, because when you get older, you learn to make big decisions. Think about your own life. You learn to make big decisions based on the little steps and the affirmations that you have along the way. So you start with your little child and you say, what coat do you want to wear today? Right? And you get to middle school and you might give them the money and send them off and say, well, this is your lunch money for the week, right? It's up to them how they decide to spend it. You get to an adult, you know how to budget. So it's just like your own life, really. A lot of this is just common sense and the applicability it is to the field of disability. All that means that we have to let people take risks. We used to call this dignity of risk in the day. It just means that we have to let people take risks that, we want to protect them in some ways, but the risks you take are also ways you've learned, right? You learned more from the things that didn't quite go right than you did probably from the things that were easy and came easy to you. So, Mike, should I do these slides on person first language, or do you want me to?
Well, no, I think everybody has, all the trainees have access to the slide deck in Canvas, so they can review the last few. If you want to just, if you want to just scroll through and touch on them before we wrap up.
The points, person first language is a way of putting the person first, okay? This is a new slide I've added in the last couple of years. It's identity first language. There are people with autism, they don't want to be called a person with autism. They want to be called an autistic person. Okay, so just be aware of that. And here's what I say. It's like anything else, it's common sense. If you're confused, take your lead from the person. Listen how they describe themselves. And it's always okay to ask, right? We know this, a lot of this, this is here. You're going to probably get this later on in the year from other folks. The reason why it's so important to know how developmental disabilities is defined in the DD Act is because that's how people get mental health services in our state. Sorry about that, guys. That was a long one, but I really appreciated your discussion tonight and your willingness to share and the honesty of your answers. And I don't know if anybody has any last minute questions for me before, I'm sure folks need and want to sign off, but I'm available as well through our website. You can always email me if you have questions, and lots of times trainees they think of things afterwards and they do reach out to me. So I try to answer your questions. Please share your thoughts about tonight's session. That's the eval. So Mike will have that posted for you.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else? Any other questions from anyone? You know how to get a hold of me on my email.
And Elizabeth will be reviewing the module too. Module 1 rather, as well, I should say. So she'll share her thoughts in the discussion on the module. So thank you, Elizabeth.
All right.
And I apologize for the technical snafu at the beginning of the night. Apparently Zoom was trying to update as I was trying to use it. So it was not happy with me. So I was kind of freaking out. And I've had 2 computers going this whole time. So it's been fun. Yeah, so I posted the evaluation link in the chat. I'm also going to send a reminder email later in the week just in case. So please share your thoughts. And if you have any questions for Elizabeth, her contact information. Actually, Elizabeth, you want to pop your email in the chat really quick, but her contact information is in Module 1 as well.
Okay. I'll pop it in right now.
And recording of tonight will be available. It's usually available the next day, but I am going to be out of town for the next few days, so I'll have this up by Monday for y'all if you want to review it, okay? So thank you all again. Have a wonderful night. First thunderstorm just went through here. I don't know if anybody else got that. And luckily our power stayed on this time. So that was good.
It's pretty dark here too. So.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Everybody, thanks for your patience.
yeah, thanks everybody. Have a good night.